We're live.
Okay, everyone, this is another Wolfram Institute Community Forum. So we hold these every week if we can, and they're dedicated towards answering questions that you all might have, and engaging with you. You know, the point is not just sit passively and watch us discuss our research, but to actually engage with us live. So if you're watching this, you can post questions in the chat on Discord, YouTube, Twitch, etc. So I think that Carlos wanted to begin this by discussing a question that we got from Joel at Metaverse, one of our donors actually, who posted, yes, in the Discord channel. So Carlos, I think you have a kind of a summary of the question, and you know how you want to
Yeah.
package it and pose it. So please go right ahead.
Yes. So so Joel had some comments. This actually came from my posting of this particular paper called Axiomatic Relativity Theory, and then Joel had some comments on this particular line of research. So before we address what Joel said, which has to do with topoi and more advanced stuff, actually was curious to know what James, Nick, Bukas, you think about this particular line of work that people call axiomatic relativity theory. So this was basically the attempt from quite early on after Einstein, Minkowski, and the usual suspects were developing relativity theory to axiomatize the theory in a purely set theoretic way. That's to say, you want to axiomatize a system of algebraic structures or mathematical structures that somehow constrain something like a Lorentzian manifold, where you have your causal structure and all those kinds of things. So the basic the basic summary that you can read in this paper, actually in the first few pages, in the one that I posted, is that if you have a set with a structure of, I think they are called in the paper domains of action, which are essentially future cones. You have a set of events, and then each event has a future cone of events that it affects, and
Hmm.
then you define the causal relation in the obvious way, and so you impose the obvious thing that the event belongs to the same for every point in your set. You have such a cone. The point belongs to the cone, and the expected transitive property that if a cone is within a cone, then it's part of the effects of that event, right? So the idea is that once you impose that, and you impose some locality condition, which has to do with if you have two events that are causally dependent, and you had a third event that is causally dependent among the two, then the closure of all such intermediate events is a bounded set, right? So you can have things that blow up to infinity, and so you have some sense of locality, right? So you have a very natural axiom of locality, which is everything is at set theory level, right? You have not even topology at this point. So
Is this
the
this
upshot
paper
of,
is pre
sorry,
so is this paper pre-causal set
yes,
schematization, right?
yes,
Because it sounds like exactly like this. Like you have a partially ordered set,
yeah,
finitely local, right?
yeah. This is before that. I mean, this paper is gathering. The paper is much later. I think it's from the 80s, but it's gathering the results from much earlier research from like 20s, 30s, I think. So I think it
Yeah, but
predates causal set.
isn't the structure equivalent to causal sets?
I think there
Like
is some, yeah,
partially ordered
yeah,
sets?
yeah, yeah. It is. I think I haven't seen the details, but I think there's some theorem that tells you that this is actually equivalent in some fundamental state. But I think for the benefit of the viewers, and what I wanted to circulate with you guys is that there's this very neat story where what you're doing is capturing with set theory, with very basic set theory, the properties of causal effect, right? Basically signaling and causal effects, and then the beauty to me of this is that from this it emerges what we perceive as relativity theory, right? Like, I mean, you have you have topology, you have geometry, all those things are easy to, I mean, with some mild assumptions about the cardinality of your sets and things like that, you get quite naturally to the point of having something like space-time, and you can start to do relativity theory. So I was discussing with Athena because she was curious about relativity theory just from the very basics, and then I posted it, and then Joel mentioned connections to other pieces of work that we can maybe discuss here. But before we do that, I was curious to know like how you feel about this particular classic body of work and how you might think it relates to observer theory, and I mean just thoughts on that. I think would be quite interesting.
I'm not familiar with this particular one, but if you say that it's exactly just some pre-causal set theory, basically axioms, which is just almost the same, maybe just an earlier version of those. And from causal set, we already know that relativity can be derived purely from order. If you have a discrete order of partial ordered sets, that's enough to describe all the relativity that you know of.
So do you know exactly what assumptions you need to impose on your partially ordered set to get something like a Lorentzian manifold?
Well, not much. Basically, this is the definition of partially ordered set, and it's locally finite, I think.
Sure.
And maybe that's it.
But you get what? You get a manifold out of that?
Well, not exactly. That's going to be a necessary, not a sufficient condition for a manifold.
But that's where I think it's different. I mean, I think there is some equivalence of this particular axiomatic presentation with causal sets, but it's different in that because it's assuming this cone structure, right? Instead of just the partial order, the cone structure allows you to do topology, basically, and so you get this all the topological information out of the causality instead of having to assume that your set is topological, and then the causal structure actually induces the geometry, the Lorentzian geometry, so to speak. But the thing is, the cone structure.
When you say a cone, you already presuppose some dimensionality, right?
No, it's just a name. In fact, they don't call it cones; they call it domains of action. But it's like future cones, basically. But they're just subsets. They're just a collection of. It's a family of sets on the set. It's just a family of sets with some conditions on properties like just the intersections and the boundedness of the intersections and things like that.
Well, then I'm not sure what the actual difference. And without reading it, it's quite hard to discuss.
Sure. I mean, the difference is, I guess, that you have a partial order. So from the cones as subsets, you get a partial order naturally, but I am not sure that the partial order can. Well, I guess it can go both ways.
You just take all the elements that are greater or smaller.
Yeah. I'm not sure that those two things are equivalent. Like if you look at the axioms, I'm not sure those two are equivalent. But
like if it's supposed to give a manifold, actual R manifold, then like you need some topology in your axioms. And I think if you added like equivalent thing into causal sets, then you got manifolds too.
Well, as far as I understand, the collection of domains of action or collection of future cones and their properties supply the topology. So it's not like you have to assume the topology. Although in the paper, they assume the topology for simplicity of exposition, but then they prove a theorem that basically tells you that you don't have to assume the topology. They assume a lot.
But how do you prove that it's a manifold if it doesn't have topology?
Well, because it has a structure of subsets, and that's what you need for a topology, right? You need a family of what are going to be your open sets.
So it basically has a topology, but they don't call it that.
No, but it's not a topology. It's not defined axiomatically as a topology, but it with the properties that are capturing causality, you derive a topology. I mean, I'm not claiming this is particularly profound. I'm just saying that axiomatically it's capturing causality very explicitly, like signaling causality very explicitly, and it's not saying something like, finite intersections are opens and infinite unions are open. It's not doing anything like that, right? But however, you get something like a topological space, and in fact something like
but like you need some R-like assumptions, right? Like for every cone you have a smaller cone, or for every event you have an event between them, or something like just things that will give you continuous.
Yeah, you might you might need to assume, as I said, some mild assumptions on cardinality. Like you need to assume that everything has cardinality Aleph1 or something, right? You might need to assume that.
Yeah, but you can take omega 1 and
Sure.
then you have discrete Aleph1.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just saying that it is different from just a partially ordered set.
I also think this paper doesn't actually construct a manifold. It just constructs the structure, definition like of group of motions of space-time, it says, and doesn't concern the structure of the manifold of events itself.
Yeah,
or maybe there's no manifold construction, an actual manifold construction, just the transformation group. And that's what you can get from the partial order, from the causal sets. So
I think it has a theorem where it shows the dependence of the domains of action axioms to the topology axioms, because it assumes a lot of things of the space-time set. It assumes connected, simply connected, Hausdorff, four-dimensional topological manifold. I mean, it assumes everything that you want, except for the metric structure, except for the geometry. But I think there's a theorem. I mean, I didn't study the paper in detail. I didn't read the whole thing. I mean, it's an encyclopedic paper that is basically recovering all the work of this Russian school. But I think there's a theorem that basically, I mean, he says explicitly, these assumptions are for convenience. We prove a theorem where we show that this can be derived entirely from the axioms on the families of subsets, as future comments.
Well, so maybe I can't exactly guess why Carlos has brought this up, but as an interesting exercise, we could compare this compare this axiomatic treatment of physics with, on the one hand, this kind of computational constructivist physics that we're trying to pursue, as well as these questions of subaxiomatic foundations in this, our treatment of axiom systems in mathematics. It's kind of interesting because in the mathematics case, normally we would treat some axiom or an axiom system as some family of rules, two-way rules, rewrite rules, and you can then proceed to compute the entailments or the implications, the consequences of those axiom systems. What's interesting is in the physics case, we're also beginning with simple rewrite rules, though we don't really treat those as being axiomatic, so to speak. So there's a strong affinity between, you could even say an identity most likely, between the treatment of relativity using causal graphs and causal set theory, for instance. But it's not as though we're beginning with some axioms of causal set theory, and then we're just computing their implications. So it's kind of interesting that these things are distinct, because the comment is often made, at least by Stephen, for instance, that there's a strong relationship between mathematics and physics, whereas it's not as though our rules, at least the rules that we've had so far in the physics project, we would describe as being kind of axiomatic. Now I'll make another point, which is sometimes in discussions that I can recall in the past, we kind of view axioms, especially these elaborate axioms, as being these kind of helpful, I wouldn't necessarily call them foundations, but they provide this basis from which you can begin to compute things. it's not necessarily the case that it's the most fundamental, the most foundational, because sometimes the axioms can be quite complicated. And so you wonder, is it the case that you could get the same computations but with much simpler rule sets? So in this case, for instance, you might specify these axiom systems, and they have all kinds of assumptions that are baked into them, which means the algorithmic complexity is quite high because you have pre-constructed objects already in your axiom system. And then you might ask, well, is it the case that we could present simpler rewrite rules that happen to give rise to states that are equivalent under some emulation, for instance, where we don't have to construct as many objects or pre-construct as many objects and put them into the rule set. So, just to touch upon the physics project for a moment, I hadn't really thought about it this way in the past. There is this controversy over what exactly the goal of the physics project is. Is the goal to find some particular rule, some particular constructor or family of constructors that happens to give rise to these physical systems with the right properties that are either consistent with existing theories of physics or help to modify or resolve, rectify problems that are bedeviling these current theories of physics? Is that the goal? Or are we going to accept this notion that's also been floated, that the choice of rule is really arbitrary, and that most rules will probably give us physics for some reason, and that really the goal is to come up with some different interpretive framework for the rules? Now, the reason why I bring this up is that you can consider, for instance, the causal graph is something that's really added in addition to the rule in some sense. It's like we have the rule, we have the constructor, and then we have causal graphs, branchial graphs, and we have this interpretive framework that's kind of laid on top of the rule. And from a theory point of view, if I'm being quite strict, it's difficult to say exactly what we're doing there. I mean, in the mathematics case, it's very simple. You can, and we're going to discuss this in the next meeting. You can. I think it'll be quite. You can concretely define. Are we front-loading our model by increasing the algorithmic complexity of these constructors of these rules that lead to these rewrites, or are we beginning with some parsimonious rules and then the rewrites are themselves more complicated? You see, in that sense, it's very easy. It's not as though your complexity is leaking out. It's either going to be in your rule set or it's going to be manifest in the actual computations that you're performing. In this case, when you have these interpretive frameworks, it's like this additional meta-theoretic kind of scaffolding that you're kind of, it's overlay kind of on top of your models. You have some particular computational rule that you're performing. That thing is running, and then there's a host of additional kind of computations you might perform or different functions that you might feed your particular rule. And so it's not as though, see, what is my point? My point is that when we kind of do causal set theory with these causal graphs now, it's not as though we have rules that are encoding the axioms of causal set theory. And it's not even clear to me that we're saying that you can take an arbitrary rewrite rule and that it's kind of emulating the axioms of causal set theory. It's more that we're taking arbitrary rules and then we're building additional functionality on top of it. And it's not clear to me how to classify the complexity gains or losses when you continue to add this additional functionality. And in some way, we're then trying to recover causal set theory in that way. It makes me slightly uncomfortable because it's not as though it's being specified in the rule. It's being specified in this additional functionality, so to speak. What's my point?
Additional functionality talking about.
Well, what I mean is
it's just simple that computation satisfy the axioms of the causal set just miraculously by itself, right? That's the property of the computation itself. That's why it's so satisfying to use it in a way, right? All you need is just run your computations and you get your causal set theory for free.
You don't exactly get it for free. You have to have a general causal graph functionality in order to actually be able to recover it. Well, what I mean is if you didn't have, okay, let's take multi-way system. If we didn't have an option for causal graphs, we would not get causal set theory for free. If you just take some, let's say multi-way system.
You mean in any description of computation, right? If you actually disassemble all the parts, what goes in your computation, what goes out, as soon as you disassemble it and draw your causal effect relationship, you get causal graph. And all the axioms of the causal set are going to be satisfied automatically. You don't have to work additionally in order for it to work.
I guess so. Here's a question. So, let's say we specify some string rewriting rule. We specify some string rewriting rule. We can then apply that rule to some additional condition, and we can compute a single path. We can compute a multi-way system. You can also get the causal graph. The question is, does computing the causal graph, does it require more computation than just computing the multi-way system? I mean, it sounds as though you're making the claim that basically if you perform the computation in the first place, obviously you're applying the rewrite rules, and the application of those rewrite rules, those are the events. So you do have the events anyway when you perform the computation. But then the causal graph kind of isolates those events and kind of drops the consideration of the underlying data structure to some degree, even though it's kind of following the applications of the rules on the data structure in order to establish causality. But does it require additional computation in order to actually fish out this causal graph beyond just applying the rewrite?
Well, for us, obviously, yes, but it's still emergent property, right? Because you have a computation, you need to show that there is some kind of dependency between events going on, and as hyper observers doing an actual programming, you have to actually compute it. But if you already run the computation happened, all the events have causal dependence intrinsic to them. You don't have to work. So it's unique in a way. There's like no ambiguity of how you would extract it. It's just whether two events are parallel or time-like or space-like, whatever relationship holds between events. It just falls from the computation in principle. It's just
right. So what's interesting is we can compare two different situations, right? One is you take an axiomatic approach. You're specifying, say, the axioms that Carlos described. I'm not familiar with it, but maybe there's also a way that you could axiomatically define causal set theory. And then you have these particular rules. You can even imagine them as being rules as we do in some of our mathematics research. And you could consider the kind of entailment cone from everything that follows from those particular axioms. What we have in this case is something that's quite different, which is you have some arbitrary rewrite rule, then you're able to capture the relationships between the events in a causal graph. The only point that I'm making is that the comment, this is causal set theory, my fear is that it's something that we as modelers are saying as we're interpreting it. We're saying, oh, look, this behaves like causal set theory. But it's not built in to the model itself. Whereas when you axiomatize, you're basically taking causal set theory and you're writing down the actual, you're actually axiomatizing it, and then those would be your rules. So these are two different approaches. We haven't done much of this, comparing what we do with math, what we do with physics. In one case, you could say, well, these are the actual rules that would give you this. Let's try and find some minimal rule set where we can emulate this in some simple way. Maybe you boil it down to combinators. Maybe you compile it down to hypergraphs, and you say these are the axioms that give you this particular theory, and then we're just going to compute them. In this case, it's something that's quite different. You're taking some arbitrary rule, almost agnostic to the rule, and you're extracting this causal graph, but there's nothing in the rule. It's not axiomatic in any way, right? There's nothing in the rule that's telling us we're doing causal set theory. And there's nothing even in these graphs. Let's forget about the terminology for a second. You have these graphs that show you the events or just the applications of these rules. Now we happen to have this strong conviction
But
that this
there's
is
something in the rule. There's something in the rule because we assuming that it's a rewriting rule of sorts. And when you do
yes.
the writing update, you have this a position of when this rule actually is being applied on the state, right? And this position allows you to make this additional relation between those events, whether they're different position or the same position. And when they're different position, then obviously it's a space like separated events acting separately,
Yeah,
right? Because you can rewrite different positions in parallel, obviously, right? That's this property. Yeah.
But you
So,
need to sort of look at it. You need to look in the right direction if you want to construct causal graph. I think the question is similar into like, is the property of being prime a part of ring of integers? Like, is it baked into the structure of the integers? Like, yes and no, right?
like there's axioms and you can
It-
think of them as some class, and the actual object and model, like this computational model of rewriting rules, is what instantiates those axioms, right? So we just can say, okay, they satisfy them. And
But the key thing is that let's say you really wanted to prove that you have causal set theory, for instance. Let's say you make the claim. This is my point, right? Let's say you say, aha, so with this causal set theory, we happen to get. Sorry, you say with these causal graphs, which you can compute in general for general rewrite rule, you get causal set theory for free, right? It's a statement. There's nothing in the model. When I say the model, I mean you have this particular rewrite rule, and then you're extracting the events. There's nothing in it where we're specifying that we're doing causal set theory. We're not defining it axiomatically. We're saying you get this theory. It's an emergent theory. It's an interesting idea. We're getting this theory emergently, but the question is, how would you prove it? In order to prove it, wouldn't you have to perform some additional computational test? See, my point is, and I'm not suggesting we do this axiomatically. I'm just trying to
what
compare
exactly
it.
you're proving? You're proving that the model satisfies axioms of causal set theory.
Yes.
I think the issue is that you really need to look in the right direction and ask the right question. You like the rule and computation process itself don't like it doesn't tell you construct causal graph out of me.
Exactly. Yes. That's what I'm saying. Versus if your rules were the axioms of causal set theory, right? Those rules would basically give you the recipe, so to speak, for causal set theory. In this case, what am I saying? My point is that there's a difference between you're specifying a theory in your rules versus you're almost agnostic to your rules, but you're saying that by virtue of this interpretive framework and the ways in which you're extracting particular information about your computation, such as the events and the relationships between the events, they're getting this theory for free. However, in our theory, you would really have to prove that what you have is equivalent to causal set theory, which would then require yet another computation.
Like it requires a concept of it requires having a concept of causal set already, right? Like I mean, in the ring of integers, what tells you to look into numbers that are like indecomposable, or that are prime? There's nothing. You need to have an idea of primeness.
Yeah, so causal set theory is an ideal,
So,
and rewriting rules, an actual numbers. Right? That's the analogy. No, there's like different levels
yeah,
of
like
abstraction.
information if the number is prime, like is already sort of in the ring of integers. But to extract it, you need to basically ask the question. You need to come up with
Yes,
an idea to ask.
right.
Like it's like asking what are axioms actually doing. They specify you a list of schemes that you have to, in order to find an actual instance that satisfies those axioms, you have to satisfy those the scheme of each of the axiom, right? So it's like an interface of sorts. So causal set is an interface, and an actual computational model constructed from rewriting rules is an actual object.
Right, but I
Oh,
guess the difference is that in one case, if the axioms are in the rule set, then the interface is really actually built into your rewrite system. Whereas when you do it this other way, where you take some arbitrary rewrite system, and then you as the modeler kind of make a narrative about your computation and what exactly it is, at least my slight fear is that in some sense, this is kind of a meta interpretation on top of the model. And the reason why I'm posing this concern is not really because of this particular case with causal set theory. It's more that what I'm worried about is that as we try and construct more and more elaborate or sophisticated objects, we basically are just going to have arbitrary, like imagine if we had this whole theory, which was very simple rewrite rules, and you have these simple rewrite rules, and then you tell people, look, we've constructed the meson, and people say, well, how? We say, well, we have this is the interpretation for this is the interpretation for that, and we have this very elaborate, flamboyant interpretation scheme for how to make sense of these nodes and these edges. And then, you basically tell people if you commit yourself to all these interpretations and you're willing to accept all of these properties, this is how you define energy, this is how you define charge, this is how you define spin, this is how you define flavor, color, etc. If you accept all of that a priori, then with this very simple rule, you happen to get the meson. And the point is that as almost like an accountant, I'm trying to think, well, where's the complexity baked in here? Because we're making this claim, you have this very simple rule. So from a kind of an algorithmic complexity standpoint, it's very parsimonious, which, in terms of Occam's razor, et cetera, that makes you feel good. Wow, we've come up with this very simple constructor, highly minimal, and we were able to get all these elaborate objects just by using this simple constructor. However, it seems as though I fear that there's some cheating involved, because if then you couple it to this very sophisticated, Dungeons and Dragons-esque, interpretive scheme where there are all these rules, and then there's all of this kind of, constraints and conditions, and this is something that is not even really properly formalized, but we've kind of defined it, or maybe you formalize it, but you formalize it kind of mathematically. My fear is that you've basically taken all the complexity that you would have put into those rules, and instead you've kind of lifted it to this meta interpretive scheme for understanding your graphs. And there's really no complexity minimization there at all. You could have taken all of that interpretive framework and front-loaded it into your rules, where you have these rules, where you have these sophisticated objects, and you have all this information actually encoded into your framework itself. And
but the
then
difference is
it wouldn't be a simple constructor at all. It would be basically, suppose you have, charge, blah, 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 blah. You have all these properties in the rule, and then, yeah, voila, we get these particles. And someone would say, well, no shit. Yeah, you got all these particles. You basically define the particle in your rule. And in this case, we have a simple rule, but we define the particle, the conditions to define a particle in this interpretive framework. So this is my concern, which is, this whole art of working with very simple constructors, it's never even been defined this way in the past. If you look at things like NKS, for instance, this is just the art of studying simple rules and their own behavior, usually for its own sake. Every once in a while, it's used to model turbulence, and you can build a cellular automata that can do things with prime numbers, etc. But usually, it's just for studying its irreducible behavior. Now we're in this position where we want to construct objects for them, and I'm not sure that there's been a serious discussion about, can you construct sophisticated objects from simple constructors without this cheating scheme where you're basically taking all that complexity that you would have put into your constructors, and instead you're trying to kind of hide it in this kind of interpretive framework that is almost exogenous to your model and is basically something that the modelers know about, and you kind of it's almost like an accounting trick in terms of where's the complexity. Instead of where's the debt, in this case, it's where's all the complexity. And if it's kind of exogenous to the model, because you're basically saying, yeah, we have this simple constructor, but then you have to pay attention to all these details of the graph, and this means this is energy, this is momentum, this is charge, this is spin, this is flavor. It seems as though we didn't minimize complexity at all. We just hid it somewhere. So that's my main concern.
Vince,
this is interesting.
Vince Spies on the chat says, can you just use your eyes?
Well, that is what we're doing to some extent, right? Which is, especially since everything is graphical, it's like we have these simple rules, and then as soon as you're looking at them and you're making all these assessments of them, these are computations that you're basically doing in addition to the first computation that you did, and now the computation that we're just doing in our heads. And technically, that should be part of it. My point is that if we were purer about it, technically that would all be endogenous to the model, and it would not be a simple model. This is my concern. And this relates to what we're going to discuss during Carlos's thing. But I'm increasingly of this position that complexity doesn't just go away. You just are allocating it to different forms of complexity. It can be the algorithmic complexity, how complicated your rules are, it can be the time complexity, how long it takes you to compute given the computational power that you were given with your rules. And technically, I think it can also be, I don't know what to call it, but it's like meta modeling complexity. It's like complexity that you're outsourcing to your interpretive framework, where you have a simple rule and you have rules that maybe even don't have to run for a very long time, but then you as a modeler are making all of these assumptions about what it means for there to be energy, what it means for there to be momentum, et cetera, and you basically outsourced it. That's kind of the last frontier in terms of complexity, is some very elaborate framework for understanding what all these graphs mean.
I would kind of make this programming analogy. You can think of all the axioms like causal set, maybe even like field theory, general relativity, as just some kind of interfaces, which I already mentioned, right? Or classes that you just have to instantiate. They have a bunch of methods. Like you have like all the axioms of causal set theory is like some method, and then acts on some arbitrary types, and then you just take an actual type, like rewriting rules, states, updating events. This is just a type that you can just instantiate with all those classes. And as the more classes you instantiate your model with, the more you can do with it, the more power it has. It's like, and it happens like, I think in mathematics in general, it happens all the time. As soon as you find this common type that you can instantiate, like, oh, we can like make an instance of this polynomials in algebra and in geometry, and now we can use both methods from those classes together to prove some more powerful theorems and instantiate more classes and interfaces with the same kind of underlying type and make connections between them, right? Here's basically do the similar thing. We find the common ground as a common type, as this computational model, and we look at the actual, what is the road to the higher level hierarchy of these interfaces, building up to all the theories of physics. For causal set theory, we go to the relativity. What is the actual, we can also instantiate some kind of multi-way class or interface and go to the quantum foundations and all. That's how the analogy works here. It's kind of neat. I don't know whether you like it or not.
Well, the only thing about it is that if you have, so let's say I have some grand theory that that has all these types, and you're saying that, you know, this is a term of this type, this is a term of this type. You know, we can identify these two terms. This is a proof that these two terms are of the same type, and you build up your entire infinity groupoid, for instance. Having something like that is quite different from some fantastic scenario in which you have one single computation that happens to give you all of physics. I mean, this is part of our discussion, I think, probably ultimately pushes on this point.
Single
Which,
computation.
well, I know, but
the idea
well,
of single computations, I think, is wrong. There's no single rule that gives all the laws of physics that we know of.
well, so I'd like to suggest a kind of a third alternative to the two alternatives I've seen so far. If you go back to Stephen's original TED Talk, it was, we're going to find the one rule that gives us our universe. You know, there's going to be one computational rule, and that's going to give us everything. And I think, as Stephen even said, it will be a hard project because it will involve a theoretical framework that goes at least as deep as existing physics. This was, I think, Stephen's language, I think, verbatim. Now, this relates to what I was just saying, which is, again, I think that if my overall thesis about complexity is correct, that you can do that. You can find a very simple rule and then create a very elaborate theory for explaining how that rule gives you all of physics. But you haven't achieved a simplicity gain, because you've just, instead of having a complicated rule with very little interpretation, you have a simple rule with significant interpretation. Having a complicated rule just means the ontological content of that rule is stronger. If you make the ontological content of the rule very thin and anemic, then you have to have this very strong theory in order to explain what the rule is doing. And so it seems as though there's basically no free lunch when it comes to complexity, and you can't make the lunch cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, that was one possibility. Now, the second possibility, which is not unrelated to the first one, is, well, you can use any rule. You can use any rule, and as Stephen put it, then the object of this, the goal, is just to create the correct language design. And that really, I think, concedes my point, which is, yes, again, pick any rule. All you have to do is develop a very elaborate theory for making sense of that rule. So if your rule isn't ontologically rich with pretension, then you have to create this interpretive framework that explains how everything is going to relate to one another. Versus if you have a rule that's ontologically rich and you have all these objects that are baked in, then your theory can be, your interpretive theory for explaining the relations between these edges and these vertices is somewhat relieved, because you've done some of your ontological work ahead of time. Okay, so it's not surprising that this is how it's been set up, because again, if you have a simple rule, you have to have a very, very complicated theory. So
how about the third alternative?
Yes, right.
All rules. Why it's not all rules, possible rules that can in aggregate give you the laws of physics? It's like basically you need some kind of molecular theory of computation itself. If you run all possible rules, but your state is so big that it gives you in aggregate like laws of physics and maybe something else, right? Some ideal gas law basically for computation. If you just have a big state and you have all the rules, maybe you have a rule that's so complicated, but it's so improbable that breaks all the state completely. you just don't care, because there are much more simple rules that can act in all possible small positions of this giant state, and it's kind of resistant to these changes like that, just probabilistically.
Well, this is going to be some debate that I think Nick and I have for some time, but it seems that kind of the idea that if you take all possible rules, they'll all kind of converge to the physics that we see seems to me so non-Copernican. It seems so kind of it places our physics in such a privileged position. Like it's inevitable. It's inevitable that we're going to get our physics when we could perfectly well think of other universes with with different physical outcomes. My
Yeah,
position is
different universes would be, it would depend on the actual parameterization of your rules. That's how you get multiple.
But you see, again, Nick,
Relativity.
that's just more meta theory. You see, because then you're saying you're taking all the rules, and I say, okay, but then you're saying all the rules lead to the same outcome. That's ridiculous. And you say, oh, but no, but then there's a meta theory of parameterization on top of the rules, and it's the way that those vary that gives you
Oh, in order to
different
get some
different outcomes.
computation, you have to actually use some rules. You can't say just all rules. What does it mean, all rules? You have to parameterize it in any way, and
Like-
so that you can enumerate them. Right? As soon as you have enumeration of rules, then the meaning of all rules makes sense. Or you don't
But that parameterization is an additional computation.
I'm not sure whether it's a computation or not. Take combinators. All rules means two rules. Right? And then the same kind of, you can build some kind of theory of combinators when you just have very giant states. What would happen if you just some kind of, if you construct this resistant giant state that resists this giant application of combinator that breaks all the state altogether, but it allows very small iterations.
Combinators are like highly non-local. I think so.
Oh yeah, but maybe it's like contains all this
Yeah.
nested tree when the only place you can actually act with the rule in the is in
it
the
will-
leaf, very deeply in the tree of a combinator tree.
It'd be interesting to have a theory of statistical behavior of something that is very non-local.
It's like if you're interested in some kind of aggregate macro property of computation, first you have to define it, then you have to make this theory.
Another point
here's
of view, maybe, let me jump in. You said it's like a very non-Copernican that all the rules gives you a universe. But I sort of believe in this a posteriori notion of computation. So we build the concept of computation by observing the world. And then and then computation is something that we came up with to capture the behavior of the world. And like then all the rules can give you like inevitability of our physics. But if you lived in another universe, you would have different notion than computation. Like, and
it's an interesting idea. Yes. Let me make one provocation.
If it had been like this strange organism that I don't know that perceive everything in terms of Fourier transform, right? Like wave-like organisms that like this sort of like would we even come up with the notion of computation or some other stuff, some other fundamental stuff? I don't know. Like,
yes, Wukash's point is that if computation is basically this anthropic artifact, and a residue of our own phenomenology, then why not basically make this highly self-serving claim that all computation, taken in aggregate, will give us our universe? Maybe I still
maybe not particular this universe. I'm not claiming that it's inevitable that we get our universe, right? It's just, it depends on your initial state again. Maybe you have all the rules, but when you have all the rules and all initial conditions, when you inevitably have the actual initial condition that is resistant enough to give you the laws of physics that we observe, under all rules again, whatever parameterization you chose. I don't know.
I'll make one other provocation. This will be relevant for when Richard comes, I guess. He's joining next week, and he's going to be doing all this Ruliad research. I've been thinking about how to really formalize this Ruliad research. So one thing is, I think, hopefully, and we're going to discuss this once we in the next stream with Carlos. But what I'm hoping is that we're going to get this object that is going to, will have rules and rewrite systems, pairs of them, and we'll have this kind of categorical treatment of them where your arrows, and it depends on how we set this up, presumably they're morphisms of some kind, will carry information about complexity. So when you're passing from rule to rule, what's the algorithmic complexity trade-off? And when you're passing from rewrite to rewrite system, what's the time complexity trade-off?
Well, when you attach your complexity to this morphism of computation, basically do coarse graining, right? It's like if you can compile every computation into a much simpler one, you can just attach to basically expand this single morphism or computation into multiple ones, right? It's just a subgraph. If you just treat it as a causal graph, just a subgraph of events that doing much simple computation instead of just a single big rewrite.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, I agree with that.
The complexity would be just the count of events, something like that, right? Just the size of those.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So this is one thing, which is you could pass and you could show the trade-offs between the time complexity, the number of kind of events in your longest or shortest path.
And also the thing is that it's this coarse graining or fine graining never stops. It's like you can fine grain each individual event because you can compile computational systems into each other. It's like if you compile your Boolean axioms, your compilation from end true false to false, right? You compile it with combinators, you get a bunch of new events of rewriting, of updating events made from the combinator rewriting rules. But each of those you can rewrite using hypergraphs, and then the hypergraphs can be rewrote using Turing machines, and you can circle back to combinators.
Yes.
And so on.
Yes, right. So imagine that structure of basically these kind of emulations between these different rewrite systems. Okay, so this is one structure that I'm very interested in. Now another structure is some sort of more precise way of thinking about the Ruliad itself. So one thing you could imagine is kind of something, and I'm using this language kind of abusively, but something like a moduli space of causal graphs, where you take, we've described again causal invariance as being isomorphy between different causal graphs. And a moduli space itself is just a space in which every single point is an isomorphism class. So you can imagine you go along this space and here's a particular isomorphism class of causal graphs. Now what that would mean is that sitting on top of that given point, that isomorphism class, will be this entire structure of emulations. So these are all kind of equivalent theories where you can set up the rules in different ways, but ultimately you're getting the same kind of computation. And ultimately you could kind of coarse grain or fine grain, whatever, the causal graph. But in the end, when you say, and false true, you could express that in terms of Boolean algebra, you can express it in terms of SK combinators, et cetera, it's going to give you the same thing. And so you do have, modulo of this coarse graining, you do have causal invariance. So these things are all sitting on top of the same point in this moduli space. I guess the point would be you could have this kind of relativity of I shouldn't say relativity, but you would get this notion that yes, there are all kinds of different models that could be used to describe this, and the only difference would be a trade-off in algorithmic versus time complexity. And but there is a definitive causal structure. Then in that case, I mean, part of the thing of like, what would it actually mean to develop a model that actually shows our universe? Would it have to be, Nick, that we find some rule that gives a causal graph that basically matches the causal graph of our causal history of our
that depends on the actual observers, right? Because this level of computation that you can fine grain indefinitely, it's actually interesting. Maybe that's the origin of continuity over the apparent continuity, because you can indefinitely fine grain your space-time. That's because each computation can be fine grained using another more simple computation indefinitely.
Yes.
But that would depend. But what would we actually, on which level we observe each individual event depends on the actual observers, embedded ones, and how they interact with those events, right? So they have to be of the same kind of complexity as the system itself.
Well, maybe there's some model of the observer that's basically a matter of theory choice, where the observer is basically an instantiation of the selection of a given model, where the observer can only phenomenologically experience so much, and cognitively they can handle so much. So they're going to have some experience that has so much behavioral complexity with rules that have, I don't know. But I'm trying to find some nice structural way of actually accounting for all of these possible rules and rewrites. I think this thing that we're about to discuss with Carlos is one promising step. This thing I want to start with Richard, which is thinking about a moduli space of where each point is an isomorphism class of a causal graph is another good step. And thinking about passage from even at a given point, so it's an isomorphism class. So all these causal graphs are equivalent, but you can consider even passing from one equivalent causal graph to another in terms of passage from these different rule rewrite pairs, where you're basically just trading complexity algorithmic versus time complexity. See, my claim would be that our particular universe would just sit on this moduli space. Our universe has a particular causal history. It's going to sit on that moduli space, and there's potentially an infinite number of computational models that describe it. And it's just a matter of, do you want the ontology of that model to be really complicated, such that you can compute it in less time and it's coarser? Or do you want to have a highly minimal model and then the behavior is much more complicated? And what I like about this is that it also keeps my feeling of there being some sort of a landscape. Because this is exactly what you get with a moduli space. You get, our universe is some causal graph that sits within this moduli space of causal graphs. And if you were to walk over this moduli space to another causal graph, you get a different universe. And then there'd be another whole, I shouldn't say stack, because we're talking about moduli spaces, and stack means it's something else in algebraic geometry. But you get this whole menu of potential models that equivalently describe it when you're just trading off in complexity. So this is my working. This is how I'm starting to think about this. One is, this whole notion of having a simple rule. I think my suspicion, increasingly so, is that there's no free lunch. Basically, simple rules, you get more complex behavior. This is what we know from Stephen. Stephen's basically cataloged extensively the low end of this spectrum. Very simple rule, very complex behavior. Pure mathematics, perfectoid spaces, Langland's program, whatever it is, very, very complicated rules. And hopefully what we're going to see is very simple behavior once you've front-loaded all those rules and everything in between. You can either have a lot of pretension in your objects, and I'm using pretension in the sense that you're fashioning them ahead of time, or you basically have very parsimonious rules and then the behavior is very complicated. It's all the same. It just depends on where you want to put your complexity. There's no free lunch. So that to me, if this is true, this thing that we find with Carlos's project, that if it's the case, it'll make a very profound statement about the importance of studying simple rules versus complicated rules. And in the end, they're equivalent. I'm strongly suspecting that there's some equivalence there, which is very interesting.
Speaking of which, should we move on? Because we've been live for an hour and 5 minutes.
Well, fine. Any final thoughts? I mean, basically, our next stream is going to basically be part 2 of this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just for bookkeeping, we can just restart the stream briefly.
Yeah.
All right. See you in 2 minutes.
Okay. All right. See you.